Thank you for joining us today to share your story.
It's wonderful to be here, and thank you to your audience for giving us some of your time.
Well, the book is a fascinating read of your journey through what has to be every parent's worst nightmare. I was very relieved to hear that your son had a positive outcome after all of that, but what your family went through is pretty horrific. Can you share why you decided to write the book?
Certainly, a couple of reasons. First is just as a journalist, it's kind of my job to identify a good story, and 99.99 times out of 1,000, it's something happening to other people. Even 9/11, which is a story that affected me personally, because I lived in Lower Manhattan at the time, wasn't really about me, obviously. In this case, however, I also happened to be kind of living it as opposed to just witnessing it. So that was part of the motivation, in that it looked like it was, a journalistically worthwhile effort. The other part of it, though, was personal, in that I had spent, 25 years of my life kind of training my critical facilities on other people's shortcomings and other people's imperfections and other people's errors in judgment or moral lapses. And I was interested to see if I had the capacity and the honesty to kind of focus some of those same skills on myself.
You talk in depth about the tricks of the mind and negative thinking and really the impact negative or chronic stress has on our minds. And so I know you suggest that we need an immune system for the mind, and I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yes, well, I want to speak just primarily from my own experience. I'm not a doctor or a therapist, but I can tell you that I've spoken to a lot of people, and I include myself in this. People who just kind of have a free floating anxiety, if you will. We have something to worry about, and if that goes away, it'll just kind of float around and find something else to latch onto, whether or not it has to do with our kids or our houses or our jobs or our relationships or what have you. And if you combine that with an actual kind of black swan event, right? A genuine stroke of very rare bad luck, it can trigger you into this whole cascading problem of kind of catastrophic thinking, where, something extraordinarily rare but extraordinarily bad has actually happened to you. Therefore, you're inclined to think that it's going to continue, right? That your number's always going to come up, that you're just kind of the hard luck family or the hard luck individual. And that obviously is a very defeating and negative mindset that can not just affect, the joy you get out of life, but can affect everybody around you, right? It is immediately possible to create hell on earth in your immediate environment. And that kind of catastrophic thinking and extreme pessimism can contribute to that. So when I mentioned immune system of the mind, in the course of this journey, which is the nice way of saying ordeal, we obviously learned a lot about the human immune system. My son had a very rare, very lethal primary immune deficiency, and so we had to kind of become fluent enough in that realm of science that we could participate intelligently in the conversation with his doctors. But one of the things that I thought was very interesting about the immune system that I learned is that it's not just one thing, right? It's not just one organ that performs one function, like the heart. It basically is an army of hundreds and sometimes thousands, depending on how you want to count and define the terms, of different kinds of cells that each perform a different function, that each fight a given pathogen or attacker. And as the years kind of drew on, and I and my family kind of figured out ways to kind of cope with the situation, it seemed like it was actually a pretty functional metaphor for how we were dealing with things. In other words, when it came time for our minds to try to deal with these kind of constant assaults, we couldn't just have one modality of coping or healing. We had to adopt, a whole kind of Swiss Army knife of different types of tools and different vocabularies, and everything. To be specific, I'm talking about everything from diet to exercise to faith practice to meditation, of course, and also various modes of therapy.
Yeah, so definitely an expanded toolkit, right? Yeah, it
Yeah.
was a lot.
And I guess and that's the thing. I mean, I don't think everybody is as kind of Neanderthal in their thinking as perhaps I was, but I was of a mind when I first kind of realized that I had to start doing something, that I was going to just commit 100% to a given approach. And if I deviated or I supplemented or complemented that with other approaches, that I was somehow either failing or cheating or not doing it the right way. And it took me a while to kind of liberate myself from that kind of thinking too, and realize that you're not being unfaithful, or you're not failing by adopting kind of a cafeteria style approach to whatever it is you're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually really try to reiterate frequently that like mindfulness is not a fix all. It works
Mhm.
great for certain things. It doesn't work so great for some other things. And so I totally agree with that. I think that we have to have maybe multiple modalities even in one day, depending on how big the crisis is we're dealing with. So I appreciate that. Um, you cover in the book the somewhat dichotomous relationship, let's call it a relationship between science and faith.
Mhm.
And so your wife relied more on faith, where you turned more towards science. And I was wondering now, looking back, how do you see that now? Do you see it differently than you did maybe while you were going through it?
Yeah, well, I always want to say that I never entered the whole process or never kind of identified as some kind of militant atheist. I always kind of respected religion to a certain degree, but I don't really think I understood the origins of that respect. And when the crisis hit, yes, I practiced mindfulness, and yes, it helped, but I also took immense comfort in learning about the science. Not only because it's impressive, and science is a fundamentally optimistic endeavor to begin with, right? It either, if you're practicing it, if you're learning about it, is because you're participating in the advancement of the species and human civilization, and the alleviation of some of our problems. So that was that kind of intellectual side of it. And then in terms of kind of getting meaning out of it, when you are a rare disease family and your child is getting treated, oftentimes you'll be participating in some study or other. In our case, it was several different studies. And it also felt very good and ennobling and fulfilling to know that we're somehow in a very small way contributing to this, even if it's only some little sliver of data that is kind of helping them map the phenotype, that is helping them map how their different treatments are working, et cetera, et cetera. So I found the science very encouraging. However, there were times, and some very specific moments I can remember, when I realized that the science wasn't going to get you all the way there. Let me just very briefly describe the moment when we were infusing my son's donor cells that would ultimately, heal him and form him a new immune system. We were in the room, the cells were going in, and at that moment, okay, we were, standing at the very edge, the very cutting edge of science. We're the maximum outreach possible. We're at the very border of what was known and what was unknown, right at the interface of our best medicine and human biology. And even at that moment, the doctors and the nurses were like, we think this is going to work, but we don't know. And sometimes we do everything right and it works out great. Sometimes we do everything right and the outcome is suboptimal. Some kids die. So those moments where, everybody's done their homework, everybody's, practiced the science, and you're literally standing at the mountaintop of all of, human research, and still the only thing that's going to get you forward, frankly, is a leap of faith. And then in studying and observing my wife's faith practice, which at times, kind of created certain points of friction in our relationship, because I think she felt that her faith gave her strength for the journey and a source of joy and a source of hope that maybe I could have benefited from, frankly. And she kind of, as a result, was being a bit prescriptive, if you will, in terms of how I should approach these questions. But kind of putting compartmentalizing that friction aside, which it did indeed cause, but we worked through. One of the things that I was able to learn and observe close up and be really moved by was the degree to which my wife, but also most people of faith, are practicing not because they're superstitious or because they've abandoned all their critical facilities at the church door or whatever, but because they too are finding themselves in positions where they need help. They need to find strength for the journey. They need to find a source of hope and motivation to move on and not collapse in, a kind of corner where nothing but depression and pessimism exist, right? You have to be, especially if you're the parent, you have to have a certain degree of optimism and encouragement and confidence so that your child can also kind of build off that. And so I think a lot of people are that one of the things they're trying to get out of their faith, and to the degree that it works, I think it's a wonderful thing.
I think too, and especially in reading about your relationship and about the different approaches, really speaks to the fact that there is no right or wrong involved in it. It's really what speaks to you in that moment. And it doesn't have to be a prescribed religion or a specific, science only and block out everything. I really believe that most people would probably get to that same conclusion toward the end, especially after going through what all of you had gone through.
Well, I think one of the big messages, and I'll be very brief, one of the big takeaways also is that, and this is a principle of many religions, not just Christianity, but that's the one that we're most familiar with, is that suffering in the proper context, properly understood and properly directed, can be put to a higher purpose. We're not Stoics. We don't just say, "Thank you, sir, may I have another," and heap on more pain and suffering. But we are cognizant of the fact that in the proper context and with the proper mindset, you can redirect your own suffering and the suffering of those around you and use it as a means of both attaining a higher purpose in your own life, achieving higher levels of compassion and optimism, and overall just becoming a more sensitive human being.
Yeah, I appreciated that you talk about the loving kindness practice. Mm-hmm. And where you also had some challenges with it afterwards, right? With kind of where your mind was going with it. But did you find the mindfulness and meditation tools in your kit? Did you find those to be helpful? And in what ways?
Well, not just helpful, but I mean, life-saving, crucial, must-haves. I'm not proud to say this, but for a good chunk of my adult life, I had anger management issues, and I could blame it all on my son's condition. But the fact of the matter is that it predated my son's diagnosis. I will say that the diagnosis obviously, kicked things into a whole other level, not just with anger, but with fear, with depression and sadness. And so the practice of loving kindness, which is something that I learned from Sharon Sollenberg and was able to do not just when I sit, but in the course of going about my day. I found it very helpful to kind of just wish loving kindness on almost every living being I encountered. Now, I didn't do that 24/7, but for a good chunk of, like, say, your commute, I found it very helpful to just, bless is the wrong term, but certainly to wish and try to bestow loving kindness and direct loving kindness towards whatever, a homeless guy in the street, or a guy in $1,000 suit on the subway, or a dog, what have you. Just anything that would help me kind of make immediate and present for me the other person's humanity, and implicitly whatever it is they're going through, their suffering.
It's understandable that your ordeal has probably changed some of your perspectives on life, but I really found it interesting when you talk about you're sort of trying to reemerge back into normal living. And it happened to be right at the time when Trump was elected, and the sort of the difference, I guess I would say, between everyone's reactions that you were seeing versus you and your wife's reaction. And the same thing with people complaining about a vacation that didn't go well or whatever, and that was very difficult for you. And so you talk about it being sort of an emergent pattern of a little bit of a disconnect with other people, but I also saw it as being awake to what's really important and what's not important. And so I was just curious if you think, just as human beings, do we have to suffer really badly before we finally get it, and see that perspective?
That's a really well phrased question, and I appreciate you asking me that. Yes, I mean, I would say that I would hope people wouldn't have to suffer before they realize that, for instance, practicing politics as a religion is probably not the best way to align your life, regardless of what your beliefs are. Making your politics, a dogma where there are unquestionable truths, where there are insiders to be accepted and outsiders to be demonized, where there is, unlike a lot of real religions, there's no real room for forgiveness or redemption. That ultimately is, I think, a kind of unhealthy, disproportioned, and kind of toxic approach to how we interact with each other, not just for the other person, but for oneself. I understand that politics is important. Okay, who's president matters, and certainly, wars happen or don't happen depending on who. So I'm not trying to belittle the whole thing, but on a daily basis, most of what we encounter are the people and things in our immediate vicinity. Okay, and the president is, for the most part, an image on a screen. And one of the mindfulness practices that help me is just to be able to detach from that altogether. Now, the funny thing about election night 2016, let me get it right, election night 2016, just coincidentally, I was working at ABC News at the time. I worked for A&E Networks and the History Network right then. But so I was somewhat involved, or at least present for the network's news coverage. And so I was watching it, obviously, and then I was walking around in New York City afterwards. And, New York City, pretty liberal place, people were, despairing, right? And Hillary Clinton had just, not given her victory speech at the Javits Center a few blocks from where I was. So it was like 9/11 had just happened all over again. People were shocked and, visibly upset. Literally earlier that same day, one of our doctors had called me and told me that our son's transplant was actually officially a success, that he was officially cured of his disease, that he was going to live and not die. So I was in the best mood ever. And so the point of that story is to illustrate the broader point that affects a lot of people who go through medical crises, but I think a lot of people in general, which is that you find yourself not feeling how you're supposed to feel at a given time, and you're not really engaged or aligned with the same kind of priorities and responses to given stimuli that a lot of the people in your peer group are. Everybody kind of, in the COVID age now, everybody's kind of been in the same boat, right? Of being de facto immunocompromised in the face of this new pathogen, right? But for years, right, we were one of the very few. I mean, try to rewind in your head back to like April 2020, when everybody was, using Clorox bleach wipes to wipe off their groceries and aging their mail for 3 days before they brought it in, and wearing 3 masks or whatever. I mean, we were never that hardcore. Frankly, I don't think anybody ever needed to be that hardcore. But the point is, we lived kind of in that mindset for a long time, when nobody else was doing it, except the people in our little community of rare disease people. So we've been kind of experiencing some sense of alienation from, most parts of the world for a long time. But again, it's just something you get used to and you learn to accept.
Yeah, I did find it interesting too, the sort of the parallels, because of the, you talk about the isolation and having to be so careful because, germaphobe doesn't begin to cover it, like what the pressure must feel like to try to protect your child. But at the same time, that's extremely isolating. And then for you to go through this and sort of in the book, you mentioned that you finished the book right around the time, right before the COVID shutdowns and all of that happened. And you already had the wipes and the masks and everything was already there. And it's like, so it is sharing it on a broader scale, I guess, but of course not with that intense, I can't even imagine, anxiety over, your child. But it is interesting that it kind of happened around the same time. Everything that's happened in the last 5 or 6 years, the same time you were going through all that, a lot of things were happening in the world. And I think that a lot of parents in much better situations, but still very difficult through the pandemic and the shutdown and the isolation and everything, has caused a lot of parents to question their ability to be good parents. And you do talk about that, about the inadequacy or the adequacy, right? So I was wondering if you could talk about that, about how parents, even if they're stressed, they can still do what they need to do, which you're a living example of. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, well, the whole my approach to adequacy and what I sometimes call the Gospel of Adequacy, it stems from the fact that I think parents are sometimes called upon to be heroes in ways that they may not be equipped to be. And specifically in our situation, when you read about many stories of rare disease diagnoses in children, somehow parents manage to kind of rise to this saintly level of compassion and patience and calm and giving and altruism. And it is true that that happens in a lot of cases, but it's also true that a major event like a rare disease diagnosis can wreak havoc on a family. It can lead to depression and divorce and substance abuse and bankruptcy and all these very serious things that people don't usually talk about in these contexts. But the truth is that when you're put under extreme pressure, sometimes you crack. So, and that was certainly, the case in my situation. There were many, many times in which I did not perform as well as I would have liked to, looking back on it. But the moral of the story is that if you acknowledge that, and if you acknowledge your own shortcomings and imperfections and weaknesses, which is not the easiest word for some men to use, you can then kind of do the next step, which is avail yourself of as many modalities of help as you need, and get to the level of adequacy where, like I said, you're executing your responsibilities, you're participating in the decisions, you're relating to the people around you in a constructive way, and most importantly, not making things worse.
So true. We're typically our worst enemies, right? So I guess I want to close with just asking how is your son Sebastian now? Is he doing okay?
He's doing great. He's about to start fourth grade. In many, many regards, it's like it never happened. He needs to get checked annually for any kind of long-term lingering organ damage that the chemo might have inflicted on him. But so far, it's so good. And really, we're so blessed every day. We're so grateful for that, largely because we know that it doesn't work out that way for every kid.
Right.
The medicine is advancing. The ways to both manage and cure the disease are growing every year. There's all sorts of cause for hope, but nevertheless, some kids don't make it, and some kids make it, but they make it through with complications that make their ongoing lives considerably more challenging. So, the book is in fact dedicated to everybody who's had it tougher, because there's plenty of people out there who have, and our success medically is in large part built on the suffering and the sacrifices of other patients who came before who didn't have such good outcomes.
Well, it's a fascinating story, and I'm glad it had a happier ending. And I think it's probably very helpful for people going through that process. But I also think it's an interesting, just sort of glimpse into someone that is self-aware, because maybe you didn't think you were at the beginning, but clearly you were self-aware as you were going through it. So I think that speaks a lot to everything we talked about. None of us are perfect. Stuff happens. We can't control it. But what we can do is look inward and try to figure out where we're getting off track, or what's going wrong, or how can we tend to our mind, or how do we take care of ourselves so that we can better take care of other people. And I thought it was a fascinating story, and I really appreciate you joining us today to talk about it.
Thank you. You forgot to say that it's funny.
It is funny. Okay, it is. It has funny moments. Yes.
I don't want people to think that it's just 300 pages of sick and dying kids. I mean, who wants to read that?
No, not at all. No, it was really. It was. It was like reading a novel. It was very. Again, fascinating journey to follow. And I think for many people, that we're not even aware of how many people are going through things like this because we don't hear about it. So useful
You're so right.
information too.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you again for even taking the time to read the book. And thank you again for having me on and sharing some of your audience's time with me. It's really kind of you and generous.
Thank you. And I hope your whole family stays well.
Thank you indeed. Yes, we're excited to go back to school and move on.
Great.